You already know Spartacus, the slave who almost broke Rome. At least 3 other uprisings got further. Slaves who built their own capital city, peasants who struck their own coins, a pig farmer who put on an actual crown. None of them made your textbook. That wasn't an accident. Empires like to tell a simple story about their own history. The center holds, the provinces obey, and the only real threats come from outside the walls. It's a useful story. It's also false. Between the 3rd century and the 13th, on 3 separate continents, groups of people the empire had written off as property, tax fodder, or livestock took that story apart with their own hands. They didn't just raid a village or burn a granary. They built cities. They struck coins with no emperor's face on them. One of them, for about a year, put a farmer's family on an actual imperial throne. Every one of these movements eventually lost, but eventually did a lot of work in each case, sometimes 14 years of it, sometimes closer to a century, and the empires that survived them never came out looking the same. Here are 3 rebellions that came closer to winning than almost anyone remembers, starting with the one Rome could never quite kill. Rome's Unkillable Rebellion. In the countryside of Roman Gaul, around 285 AD, a Roman writer complained that farmers had started dressing like soldiers. He meant it as an insult. He called them two-shaped monsters, half citizen, half enemy, and he wasn't wrong about the shape-shifting. These were tenant farmers crushed under Roman taxation, runaway slaves, deserters from the legions, and even the occasional disillusioned doctor. And they called themselves the Bagaudae, a word that most likely just means fighters. A Christian writer named Salvian would later go further, arguing plainly that the misery driving them wasn't some foreign menace at all, but Rome's own tax collectors and landowners. That first wave, in 285, got serious enough that Rome sent an emperor in training, Maximian, to crush it personally. He won, and for over a century the name mostly drops out of the record. Then, in 409, with Germanic armies pouring across the Rhine and Rome's own field armies scattered trying to stop them, the farmers of Armorica, what's now Brittany, simply stopped waiting for Rome to protect them. They threw out the imperial magistrates and ran the region themselves for years. Rome eventually clawed Armorica back, only for the same pattern to resurface south of the Pyrenees a generation later. By 449, a Spanish Bagaudae leader named Basilius had allied with Riciar, king of the invading Suevi, and together they tore through the Ebro Valley, sacking towns and killing a bishop along the way. Some sources describe these Spanish rebels striking their own coins around this time, currency with no emperor's face on it, a direct claim that Rome's stamp of legitimacy wasn't the only one that counted anymore. Rome kept winning the individual battles against the Bagaudae for 2 centuries straight. It never once finished the job. By the time the last Western emperor was quietly deposed in 476, the fighters in the countryside were still out there, and nobody had ever actually beaten them for good. The Marsh Empire. 600 years later, and a continent away, the Abbasid Caliphate, the largest and richest state in the world at the time, ran into a version of the same problem, except this one started in a swamp. For generations, landowners near Basra in southern Iraq had used enslaved laborers, most of them from East Africa, and known in the sources as the Zanj, to strip toxic topsoil off the marshes so the land underneath could be farmed. The work was brutal, and the living conditions were worse. In September of 869, a man named Ali ibn Muhammad, who claimed descent from the Prophet's family and was neither Zanj nor a slave himself, began organizing the laborers, promising them freedom and telling them their masters had no right to treat them as property. He also adopted an argument from a sect called the Kharijites that leadership belonged to whoever was most qualified to hold it, slave or free, rather than to any inherited bloodline, which cut directly against the Abbasid dynasty's entire claim to rule. His movement grew fast, and it turned violent in both directions. Plantation owners had spent generations brutalizing the people who worked their land, and the men who finally turned on them didn't hold back either. What made this different from earlier failed uprisings in the same marshes wasn't just the size. It was that the rebels won. They sacked Basra, one of the wealthiest cities in the Caliphate, not once, but repeatedly. They defeated the caliph's own brother in open battle. And then they did something no slave revolt in the region had managed before. They built a capital. Al-Mukhtara, the Chosen, rose out of the marshland with its own government, its own mint striking its own coins, and its own court. There's physical proof of that sitting in the British Museum right now. A gold coin struck at Al-Mukhtara in 874, carrying no caliph's name at all. Hard evidence of a rebel state minting its own money in the middle of the Caliphate's richest province. For a stretch of years in the 870s, a state run by former slaves controlled most of southern Iraq, and the Caliphate, distracted by wars in Iran and a general breakdown of central authority, couldn't spare the resources to stop it. It took the caliph's brother, Al-Muwaffaq, the better part of a decade, and eventually the personal command of his own son, Abu al-Abbas, to turn the tide. Al-Mukhtara held out under siege for more than 2 years before it finally fell in 883. Estimates of the dead run into the hundreds of thousands. The Caliphate technically won. It also never fully recovered the money, the manpower, or the authority it spent putting down 14 years of rebellion by people it had never bothered to count as fully human in the first place. And within a generation, territory from Egypt to Persia had quietly stopped answering to Baghdad at all. The swineherd who wore the crown. Now for the one that actually worked, for a little while. By 1277, the Second Bulgarian Empire was falling apart from the inside. Mongol raiders from the Golden Horde had been burning their way through the northeast for years. The nobility was busy protecting its own estates, and the emperor, Constantine Tick, was reportedly too injured to even ride a horse, let alone lead an army. Into that vacuum walked a man the Byzantine chroniclers only ever described by his old job: a swineherd, a pig keeper, a nobody named Ivaylo. Ivaylo told his followers he'd received a divine mandate to save the country, then backed it up by doing something the actual government hadn't managed in years. He beat the Mongols in open battle, twice. That alone made him a folk hero. Then he turned his growing peasant army on Constantine Tick himself, ambushed the imperial force, and by most accounts, killed the emperor with his own hands. He marched into the capital, Tarnovo, married the dead emperor's widow, and had the Bulgarian nobility crown him czar. A man who had been herding pigs a year earlier was now wearing the actual imperial crown, sitting on the actual imperial throne. The Byzantine Empire next door panicked, not unreasonably, since a peasant who could kill a sitting emperor was not a comfortable neighbor to have. They sent an army to install a rival claimant. Ivaylo beat that army too, twice. So the Byzantines did what struggling empires in that part of the world tended to do. They leaned on a marriage alliance with a Mongol Khan, Nogai, to bring the horde in against the man who'd already beaten them twice. Ivaylo held out under siege at the fortress of Dristar for months before slipping away, and he kept fighting even after losing the capital, but the coalition against him was too large and too patient. In 1281, seeking shelter with the very Mongols he'd once defeated in battle, he was killed at the request of the Byzantine emperor he'd humiliated twice. Centuries later, Bulgarian folk songs were still singing about the swineherd who briefly outranked an emperor, long after most of the nobles who betrayed him had been forgotten by name. He'd worn the crown for barely a year. It was still a year longer than anyone in Constantinople or Tarnovo had thought a swineherd could manage, and it was long enough to prove the throne itself had never been as untouchable as it looked from the outside. Look at what these 3 rebellions actually left behind. A rebel gold coin sits in a case at the British Museum, struck by people the Abbasid Caliphate never planned on arming, let alone letting mint currency. Bulgarian folk songs still remember a swineherd who buried an emperor, and Rome spent 2 centuries fighting an uprising in its own backyard that it never fully put down, right up until there was no more Rome left to defend. None of that made it into your textbook, not because it lacked drama, but because the empires that survived got to decide which almost winners were worth remembering, and a coin with the wrong face on it doesn't usually make the cut.